everybody, and welcome to The Backline with Rob and Adam. My name is Adam Colley, alumnus of the Second City Main Stage.
And my name is Rob Norman. I'm author of the cool improv book, Improvising Now, A Practical Guide to Modern Improv.
Robbie Norman, how are you?
I'm very, very well, you know.
Yeah?
Just living my life to its max, racing against Father Time each and every day. I'm trying out this new thing called a schedule, where instead of, you know, obsessively working for a week straight every minute of my life, burning out, and then not doing anything for 2 months, I'm trying to work every day from 9 to 5.
Huh.
And it's really hard. I don't like it.
It's quite bizarre to try and have a schedule after years of never having a schedule.
Yeah, and it's
like the idea of like being like, it's lunchtime. I'm going on lunch. That's a bizarre concept.
Well, and also like in our life, it's not like if you have a project you're passionate about, you spend every waking minute thinking about it, trying to resolve these problems in it when you have a creative project. And so it's very hard being like, no, I have to stop myself. I'm going to make dinner now. And that's the end of my day. I find that very, very difficult, but I'm working on it. How are you?
I'm pretty good. You know what I I just did for the first time last night, and I've got a few more on the way, is one of these meal kits. So my roommate in Los Angeles, she does this quite a bit and had these free meals. I was like, do you want them? And I was like, I don't know. It just feels like a lot. I don't know. Anyway, I got it last night, and man, I cooked. I was chopping things. I was spicing things. I had a timer. We had thermometers, and it turned out great. And I felt, it's like, I think I've talked about this before of, I'm not handy at all, but like sometimes I have to like fix the vacuum or like tighten a drawer, and it's like, oh, I feel so good, like I'm really talented and helpful. So that felt really good.
I'm not sure how I feel about that voice you're making. Yeah, and you hate food, so this is great.
I don't hate food. I am specific about, like, eating for me. It's like it's either going to be fuel, and I could care less what it tastes like, or it's like I want, I'm going to treat myself, and I'm going to go after specifically what I want, and I'm not afraid to be like, actually take this off of it and this off of it. And I know the chef says it's this way, but that's fine with me. Just dump it on the plate.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, but you're describing a man who hates food. If you're describing food as fuel, then you probably don't love food. It's like saying like music is sound.
Yeah. Well, no, it's like music is something you can move to, or like music is like, it brightens the day, or it's nice to have on in the car. And sometimes you're like, oh no, I'm going to hear this band. But most of the time you're like, whatever's on is fine.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're getting more in touch with your the culinary arts. That makes me very happy, Adam.
Thank you. Yeah. Because I always get jealous when when we're at a cottage or when we are touring, you like to take care of some cooking. You enjoy that.
Yeah, I like cooking. I think it's fun. I don't like recipes. I'm not a big fan of like reading from a book and like following all the directions. I kind of like my way of like feeling through a recipe, or like I'll read the recipe and be like, oh, cool, let me adjust it or something. So I am.
So you
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say you're not really into structure.
I treat it like an art project, which, you know, you have to really love me to endure eating my food, because there are some creative liberties I take.
Some license from Rob.
Yeah, that's
well,
right.
Speaking of structures that you don't like following, I want to talk about the Herald.
Here we go.
So Rob, I remember when we first met, you had already heard about the Herald. You were reading about the Herald in high school. And I believe you were coaching a Herald team before you had ever seen or performed a Herald. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
All of your best Herald coaches are someone who has never seen it or never performed it.
For sure.
And at the high school level, the Herald is really what we want to attack to get people excited about improv. But Rob, I want to talk to you about it. I would associate the Herald with you quite a bit, just because you've been interested, aware of it for so long. So I'm in LA, second city, Hollywood. We don't have a building right now, but doesn't really focus on the Herald. The Annoyance, love the Annoyance, doesn't really focus on the Herald. The Pit in New York teaches it, but it's not kind of their whole philosophy. But IO West is gone. IO Chicago is gone, but might be coming back. UCB, gone in New York, gone in LA. So Rob, my question to you is the Herald just dead?
Is the Herald dead? Like, is it never going to be performed again?
Like, what is the use of the Herald? If the main training centers in the world that created / perfected, honed the Herald and really promoted it as this is our style, if they're gone, what's the point?
Not to be glib, but my question would be, was the Herald ever alive to begin with?
Yeah, like people base their entire personalities on being a Herald player, right? It's like if you become, you're part of a team, you have an identity. These teams have like Instagram pages, like they tour, like the idea of what kind of Herald player are you helps people understand what kind of improviser you are, whether you are into the Herald or not. Like it was very prominent and still is. But it seems like as we come out of this pandemic and get back into theaters, who the hell wants to see or do a Herald?
Well, I mean, I think first we need to just to define what the Herald is, because I feel like, I know on Del Close's deathbed, Del was obviously not the inventor of the Herald, but a massive contributor to the art form. He really popularized it for most of American comedians. He said on his deathbed that any long form that had an opener was the Herald, which is a bold claim to make. Basically, he took credit for every long form structure that's ever existed. So in that definition, do I think that is dead? Do I think long form is dead? Well, it's definitely not. You and I can attest to that. We were in a very successful long form troupe for 15 years that had sold out shows. There were many nights where we turned... It wasn't a small theater either. It was like a 110-person theater. We had 120, 130 people packed in there, and we were still turning people away. So that idea of what long form is or could be is definitely not dead. But if you're talking about monologue opener into 1A, 1B, 1C, group game, 2A, 2B, 2C, that's a more difficult conversation to have. I don't think it's dead. I don't think it'll ever die. I don't think people will stop learning it or stop performing it or stop talking about it. But I do think its relevance is waning. And I do feel like, for a lot of young performers, they learn this format. They take a Herald class. They bought into the hype. They were told that this is the rocket ship that incorporates all other improv innovations. That's a quote from Improv or Truth and Comedy. And they go to do it on stage, and they do a fine job at it, and see a very disappointed audience. That is a familiar story that I'm told. So, is it dead? I don't think so. Is it alive? I think it's in limbo. I think it exists between worlds.
Okay, so I was at UCB and go to Herald Night. And Herald Night is almost always sold out, if not jam-packed. The host comes out, and they're talking, welcome everyone, and then asks a question, who here is a student at UCB? It's a 99% of people put up their hand. So you take away those students who clearly understand and have been studying and want to get better, so who are primed to enjoy this performance. You take those people away, you put in, your aunts and uncles and my brother and his college friends, do they enjoy it? Like, do they have a good time, or are they like, what the fuck is this?
Well, I mean, you and I have also experienced, maybe 15 years ago, we would travel to Chicago, and it would be a weird night. It'd be like a Thursday or Friday at midnight, and we'd go to the IO, and we would see people in prom dresses for a Herald night, and we're like, what are you doing here? And for their after prom, they're like, we're going to IO to watch a Herald. So I feel like there are certain theaters or shows that can draw people in, and they can have a pleasant experience. But I do hear what you're saying. I mean, I think one of
Cool. Well, it's like, okay, if you Rob were running a training center, you're running a theater, someone calls you and says, hey, our prom wants to come to your theater for the after party. What show are you putting on? If you want to guarantee that they have an amazing time Friday night after prom, they're all maybe, I don't know what age you are if you're drunk, whatever it is, they're ready to party. What are you putting on to give them the best show? Are you putting on a Herald?
I mean, what does my theater specialize in? If it's the Herald, I'm going to put on the Herald. If it's, an amalgamation of the shows that are in Toronto right now, most likely not, because there's so many other formats kind of running around that are perhaps easier to perform or have a higher success rate. We talked a little bit about the disincentives to improvise in one of our earlier episodes. But that's a really good example. You have a big client, you have 50 people, you want to do a good job, great. We should probably put something that's a little bit safer in there. But IO back in the day was not afraid of putting on the Herald and making that the main event. That was what IO did. And I think if your whole theater, your whole financial model is based around doing good Heralds, you're going to figure out a way to do good Heralds. The people coming up are going to focus on Heralds nonstop. In Toronto, we have the advantage, the disadvantage about being torn in 7 different directions for each different kind of school of thought around improv. So you get very good at everything, but we very rarely specialize in one kind of specific format. I don't think you'd have a very prosperous career in Toronto if you just did one kind of improv and that's it. But I think the kind of questions that you're raising is the Herald vibrant enough to survive in 2022? This is a format from the 1980s, and things that were impressive then, 40 years ago, may no longer be impressive now. Have you ever seen a classical version of the Invocation? I have. I've seen it. I've seen students do it. It's not for people of this time. It's a different world. It is a kind of artifact from the 1970s. Now, there are adaptations. I've updated the Invocation to do something that's a little bit more palatable for audiences. So that improves it for the most part. But this rigid structure does not necessarily mean success. Being able to pull off a ABC Herald doesn't mean that the audience is going to applaud. It is just a container. And if the content doesn't stand on its own, then the container gets no reward from the audience because they don't understand what that container is. And I would say, from my own perspective, I do find performing within that structure, using that container, to be a challenge. It makes my job as an improviser harder to perform within a set structure than to just follow the general energy of what's happening in a show. So to answer your question, will an audience enjoy it? In Toronto, probably not. I've never seen a Herald night that has happened here that has been audience favorite. I've never been to a Herald show and been like, oh, lineups out the door, I can't go see my favorite Herald team. That's never happened in Toronto. With other shows, yes, but with the Herald, no.
And in LA, it's you go to Herald night, but as I said, everybody there knows what Herald night is. Mm-hmm. They're all excited about Herald night because the audience wants to get on the Herald teams. But then you see a Herald team and you see the magic, and they're very good. Like the UCB Heralds I saw were very good. Some of the best I'd ever seen. But then you see it again, and you see it again, and the students don't mind because it helps them. They're there picking out the excellent moves by the premier improvisers. So not only are they excited about the improv, but they're also so in tune with what's happening on stage that, again, my mom comes into the show, buys a $25 ticket, being like, I'm going to see improv comedy. I've seen Whose Line. I've seen other things on TV. It just feels like the Herald, it's too risky and requires too much investment from everybody, the audience and the players, to have it be good enough that it feels like the way things have been dispersed throughout improv cities around the world. I don't know. I don't know if it'll ever come back.
Well, and you know what you're talking about, this very rigid format at UCB or Free Association, which almost kind of feels like when you're looking at the style of play, it almost feels like a narrative video game map where it's like, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. And so these moves are very regimented. There's very few moves that are happening within that structure that people are going, what do we do now? We're on the edge of not knowing. This is new territory for us. You have rehearsed this and developed these kinds of substrata structures that allow you to not have to think about what's going to happen next. You know what the preset move is supposed to be. And for me, this kind of gets away from ultimately what the Herald is. And I wonder if, when we're talking about the Herald, if we're stepping away from the structure, the mechanisms, which I think is the least interesting part of this, and kind of tie back to the theme. The theme for me is the form. Like the structure is the scaffolding, and the building that we're trying to build is the theme, if that makes sense. The great Notre Dame Cathedral is the theme. The scaffolding is something that's just to help us to get there. And the theme for me about the Herald is to move from random to connected. So the show starts out with a bunch of random ideas, intentionally random. That's why I love the idea of something like the pattern game, because it generates a whole bunch of ideas and also demonstrates to the audience that the end is the beginning, right? We're getting back around to that original word. And once we have all of these ideas, our goal is to take these random ideas, have it explode out with more ideas, which is the ABC structure, these 3 disparate scenes. And the promise is by the end of it, it all comes together at the end. Now, if you were to say to me, is that dead? And I would say, absolutely not. And we have tons of examples where going from random to connected has worked. Your favorite show, Seinfeld, does that. The movie Magnolia does that. There are so many different examples that we could give where everything kind of connects at the end as viable pieces of art. Then in that regard, I don't think the Herald is dead at all.
Okay, so if you are at an indie theater,
go on,
or you are an individual improviser and you are traveling around, you are looking for a new theater, do you think that being trained in the Herald is going to help you more than being trained in general scenic improv? If you are looking to join in one of these theaters or join a team, audition for something, do you think the idea of training centers being like, we should teach the Herald because it teaches a lot of skills, versus those skills are skills that are needed for the Herald, and the Herald is not going to be performed very often, especially at this theater? So do you think we should even still teach it? Okay,
so yes, I do. But let me take a step back. Because you could teach the Herald or you could not teach the Herald. What do I think that audiences don't want to see? I don't think they want to see a bunch of improvisers who are undertrained and chaotic doing a bunch of scenes without any kind of structure whatsoever. Now, for the most part, I'd say short form takes care of your structure. The structure is explained to the audience and you're protected within the structure of the game. If you're just doing open scenes and you have no relationship with structure, the written part of improv, then Yeah, I think you're going to have some difficulties. All improvisers need to learn some kind of structure, and you're either going to do that through something like the Herald, a format like the Herald. You're going to do that by being on stage and suffering enough losses that you're forced to learn some kind of structure, because you'll figure out just from doing it hundreds of times, the audience, that show didn't do well. Last week was much better. Why? So yes, I think whether you like it or not, you're going to have to learn structure. Now, the question is the Herald the best way to teach structure? And I don't know. The Herald was the way that I learned structure. I mean, I learned it before I learned how to do scenes. I mean, you were joking about this before, but when I was 16 years old, I was part of like a youth theater company, and there was an older member who had a improv show approved, and he bailed on it. And they were like, we have all this budget for this improv show. And I was, maybe it was like 15. And I was like, I'll do it. I'll produce it and I'll direct it. And they were like, you're a funny guy. Sure. So I got my friends who are my age or older, and I started teaching them how to improvise. I didn't know how to improvise. My mom was a librarian. And I started to take out some books from the library.
What does that?
Listen.
What does that have to do with anything?
My mom's a librarian. I say, you got to help me. I got to figure out how to improvise. So she looks up in the computer improv books, and she brings home Truth and Comedy. I photocopy it, and I try to do what Truth and Comedy said to do. And I'll say, we did figure out Game of the Scene during that time. Game of the Scene, we had figured out. We figured out the structure of 1A, B, 1C. No problem. The thing that we were unable to figure out was scenes. We didn't know how to do scenes. And we didn't learn how to say yes and either. So we had Game of the Scene, A, B, and C, and that's pretty much it. We did the preset openers. We did the group games that were in that book. But I know that book backwards and forwards because it was the only thing I had. I did that show for 3 years, too, by the way. I should mention. It kept getting renewed again and again. And so I was trying to figure it as I was doing it. So I don't know a world where I don't see improv through the lens of the Herald. But, if we take a look at something like our friends at the Improv Comedy Copenhagen, these are folks who started not with short form, but they started with the Herald. And because of the setup of their theater in Denmark, there was a core group of about 10 people who were performing Thursday, Friday, Saturday night doing Heralds. And they were way better than they should have been. I remember you and I arriving and seeing our friends there being like, oh, these guys have been performing for 3 years. And they were like, no, I've been doing this for 6 months. I'm like, whoa, you're tackling the hardest format. You have less experience than someone who has done the ADE program. And you're really, really good. So I definitely have seen the benefits of learning that structure at an early point in your career. I think in a weird way, too, this conversation is a bit moot because I feel like if you're a young improviser and you read about Dell and you read about the Invocation and you read about the magic of the Herald, like the Truth and Comedy is this amazing piece of propaganda for this format. The way it spends more time talking about the famous people who have done it and all of the crazy magical things that have happened than it does actually tell you about how to do this thing. And so people are always going to want to explore it. People are going to want to know it for themselves. But for you and I would say, if you were to say to me like, hey, Rob, there's a cage match. Do you want to come do a Herald? I would say yes. I would say yes in this kind of like self-flagellating way where I'd be like, can we pull this off? Because I know there's a more successful, like, open long form that you and I could do that would do much, much better. But I'd like to see if I could do a Herald in a cage match and win. That's an incredible handicap to have. Let's see if we can pull it off. But you and I can both agree that an open long form structure would probably be better because we know the structure by now. It's in our bones. So we don't need someone to explain to us that B should happen. We just feel like B should happen.
And I think you and I are and anyone listening to this are unique in that way in terms of how much they enjoy improv and want to study it and learn about it and explore within it. It does just also feel like the amount, unless you have the time and resources to rehearse this thing with an outside eye, it feels like if you tried to go to a different city and you're like, oh, you guys are doing Herald night? Let me sit in with you guys. You couldn't do it. And so it feels like, again, the way people are no longer going to be associated with one theater and following their rules and having a controlled environment where your Herald is protected by your coach and the mandates of the theater, the Heralds are just going to get sloppier and sloppier and odder. And the precision and the connections that really make them pop, like you talked about Seinfeld, some of those moments where those connections result not only in laughter, but in screams. People can't comprehend that these things connect. Without the time and resources to rehearse and make sure those things happen, these loose, flimsy Heralds, it feels like you're just going to keep proving to people that the Herald is kind of shitty.
Or the other option is you have something so down pat that you end up with this thing that is so far from improv at a certain point. You know, it's something that is so heavily structured, so rigid, so over-rehearsed that, you know, we're so far from improv. It's basically, we'll always do this opener. Adam usually at the end of it has a button. He's the button guy, so we'll look to Adam to do the button. And it's usually a similar kind of button where he undercuts the reality. And then we go into 1A. Rob usually likes to start 1A, so he'll do that. He'll do his wizard character. That works well. And then, you know, Jan will do whatever she does, and we'll move on. So I definitely hear you on that front. I think another thing that we haven't really brought up yet, and this is something that we have to be mindful when we talk about these microstructures or macrostructures. Like the Herald is a macro structure. It's a mechanized way of playing. Game of the scene or some of these technique-based ways of playing are heavily structured. And then a big part of that, once you're in that structure, is you spend all of your time trying to disguise the structure. You spend all of your time trying to make it look organic, right? Which is, that's a quote from Truth and Comedy. It's a promise there. I think at the beginning of the book, Del quotes something in Latin where it's like, art est celare artem, which is like the artist in concealing the art. And yeah, it kind of feels a little bit like perhaps that showmanship could also be kind of charlatanism as well too, where it's not really improv anymore, but now we're pretending it kind of is, or we're pretending that we don't know this structure. Much more interesting to me as an art form when we don't have to pretend when we really don't know.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm with you. I remember you and I won't say the team or their form, but you and I were at a festival, and this duo came out, and they were like, hey, we are blank, and tonight we're going to perform our signature form called the blank. And I remember you and I were like, I've never heard of that. Okay, like, whatever.
What is this? Yeah, what is this?
Like, watching the show, I was just like, well, I don't typically enjoy this. I'm not having the best time. And I also feel like I'm missing something because I don't know what your form is. So I don't know how to enjoy it on that extra level. Sometimes when you perform a Herald, you would explain at least the structure some theaters do to an audience to help get them on board at least. But hearing these kinds of things like, hey, this is our structure and get ready for it. It kind of felt like, unless the scenes are good, who gives a fuck? And so you start to think the Armando, Pretty Little Flower, the living room, like, who gives a fuck about any of it? Why would we bother doing any of those things? Do you think forms in general, it's just like, hey, Rob, I got this theater in a basement in the edge of town because no other theaters exist anymore. Do you want to come and do this show? The idea of being like, well, before we do, we've got to make sure that our structure is set. and we have to go from this to this, and then that leads to that, versus, look, let's just do a bunch of scenes, enjoy working together, not worry about trying to fulfill some form for some phantom teacher who's not there, and just perform. I think the audience would have more fun, and I think the players would have more fun.
I'm just trying to think. Okay, so I'm going to reference Star Trek now. Is that okay?
Sure, let's give it a shot.
There's a shapeshifter on a show that I hate called Star Trek Deep Space Nine. It's basically Holiday Inn in space. It's a terrible show.
Is this Captain Janeway?
No. This is Benjamin Sisko. He's a bald man who likes baseball. Anyways, so in the show, there's this shapeshifter who can become anyone they want. And they meet this young shapeshifter, changelings they call them. And he doesn't know how to shapeshift. So what Odo does is he puts them in a bunch of different containers. He puts them in a cup and goes, feel the circle of the cup. And then he pours out the shapeshifter and be like, you try and hold that form. Okay, here's a triangle. And he puts them in a triangle and then pours them out. You try and be a triangle. And this little shapeshifter tries to hold this form. And he can only do it for a little bit. But at the end of the episode, he's able to move from the triangle to the sphere to people to animals. That's how you teach a changeling how to exist. I feel like for us as improvisers, this is also true. Do I think the Armando is going to save your butt on stage? I definitely don't think it will. I think you could get really good at it, and we've had some success out of all the long-form formats. There are shows like, for example, Monkey Toast that has historically done well for itself using a version of the Armando. But the real value is putting new players into these different containers, and later, when they're playing in an open way, they're able to hold that form. And let me give you an example of that. So because you and I have done so many Armandos, doing a monologue isn't an intimidating thing. And when we were in our troupe, Mantown, which for a while had only you, me, and star of the podcast, Jason DeRoss, we had some pretty big issues. Because it meant that if two of us were in a scene, after it was swept, then one of those people who was already in that scene had to come be in the next scene. That is exhausting for an improviser, even as trained as we are. So we found this solution, or I found this solution, which is...
No, you found a solution.
And the solution for me was when we got tired, I would walk out on stage and I would do a monologue. And I would try and take up as much space and make it go on for as long as I could to give you guys a break. And I don't think those monologues were ever incredibly successful, but strategically we needed a breath, we needed a recharge. That's not possible without the Armando. Maybe it is. It wouldn't be possible for me without the Armando. That history, holding that structure, being on stage by myself, telling my true stories about myself, learning that container allows me to repurpose it for an open, organic, long-form set. We've done open, long-form and had everything connect at the end without talking about it, without deciding it. Most shows we didn't do that, but some shows that's what happened. That's not an accident. That's kicking around somewhere in your improv DNA. You know that you can reach and pull for that, and you know how to do that because you've trained. Now, how many audiences suffered through our training, through being on stage and doing those formats unsuccessfully? Well, probably thousands, hundreds or thousands of people were turned off from improv from seeing us perform in our early stages. So I would say these forms have value for us. What I think the issue is, and I think what the resistance is because there are teachers or there are institutions that glamorize these forms. And they make them sound like they're this kind of spiritual experience that's going to yield these results, that you're going to be transformed by playing within that format. And you just definitely won't. You will learn the structure. You will suffer through it. The audience will suffer through it. And either A, you'll spend the time to make something rigid and successful. You'll mechanize this format for your own use, or you'll abandon it and you'll take the lessons that you learn from that form and apply it to the work that is actually relevant to your community.
Well, it's so funny that you reference how many people suffered through our training. Again, it goes back to, well, you're right. I go back to when we talked about improv and how it's advertised. And again, you think of any sports, it's like, well, as people are training and getting better, they are put in a certain league, and it's you are in the minors, and you slowly work your way up. Because if you were like, oh, I am an NHL caliber team with you and your 16-year-old buddies, it's unfair to charge NHL prices to expect an NHL quality performance by these people. So that idea of letting the audience in on, hey, this, you may suffer, or adjust your expectations because of the way we have explained how our show will work. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so speaking of all these forms, whether they survive, whether they die, whether they're morphed into something else, what do you think is next? We've kind of had this 2-year break. Some things have tried to be shoehorned to online. Some things have just not been possible online. We've had to make adjustments to the way we do scenes, the way we edit scenes, so many adjustments. But I think people are clamoring to get back live on stage, and some have already. But what do you think's going to grow from this? Do you think there's going to be a new form, a new style, something that catches on that just becomes more popular than anything we have now?
I think there has to be a new form, and there has to be a new style. I think we can't continue to prop up these forms that are from the 1980s. It makes no sense. There's no other art form that is still, I mean, if you think about music, like the music of the 80s, it's not like we found a genre and kept playing within it. In fact, probably it's looped. We've gone so far away from the 80s that maybe now it's popular again. That doesn't really happen in improv. I mean, there definitely are fads or things that people are more interested in at certain times, but for the most part, structures like the Herald, like theater sports remain. New games, new group games exist within these containers, but for the most part, they're kind of maintained, often by institutions, right? Institutions like UCB and IO are going to continue to prop up the Herald because that's their identity, so they need it to exist. But, when we think about art, and Malcolm Gladwell would probably talk about this, that the best art or the most valuable art for us happens on the fringes of our culture. So it is happening in that bar, not part of Second City or the main institution. They are working in a new way that maybe the establishment resents or does not like. You and I had this experience firsthand. When we arrived on the scene, there wasn't a party drinking improv show that had never existed before, and it didn't come from us thinking that we had a new way to improvise. It was because we were young and stupid and we were partying anyways, and we just wanted to combine the two things. But
we can get paid to party.
Not paid though. We're allowed to party. We can party in front of people. And as soon as you create that fringe show and it becomes a success in the way that our show was, then you're going to see people take that idea and then they're going to create copies of it. And those copies will either be parodies of the original thing, or they will find ways to improve upon your idea and make it more palatable for the general audience, kind of shave off the rough corners. And so you'll end up seeing, it's not a surprise to me that Second City started to do a run of party shows, right? Like this Riot is a Party. Is that what the show called?
Excuse me. It's the Canadian Comedy Award winning Something Wicked Awesome This Way Comes, followed by This Party's a Riot.
Yeah, I got it right. This Party's a Riot.
Sort of.
Yeah, so like that wasn't a big part of Second City, where it's like, oh, we're all drunk, it's so much fun, it's wild. I think we put something out into the ether, and Second City went, ooh, cool, I think this is a good direction for us to head. So that is why it's so important for us to maintain a healthy independent comedy scene. because these institutions will decay. These huge structures are not creating new ideas because they have budgets to worry about and filling up the house. You mentioned this group of people from prom. It's like, I'm not putting in this new experimental show when I have an audience of 50 people who have never seen improv before. I'm putting in shoulda said. I'm going to put in short form because I need to save my ass. Well, for our art form, there's no value to that. So we do need to support independent comedy. We do need to support these backroom shows. For the people who are out there taking risks, they should be rewarded. We should value their work and their attempts and their failures, because that's the only way that improv as an art form survives. It's the only way. So I don't know what the next thing is. And if I did, I would make it. That's my answer.
I wish you'd have said like, ooh, it's the cardboard box. It's the new form, cardboard box. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Rob, thank you so much. I'm curious if you have thoughts, our listeners. Is the Herald dead? Are forms dead? Do you have a new form in your town, in your city that you're like, oh no, we're working on this and we're really excited about it? Reach out to us at The Backline Pod on Facebook and Twitter, and The Backline Podcast on Instagram. Share your thoughts. Rob, before we head out, anything on stage, off stage that is inspiring you right now?
You know, as I was kind of typing up notes for this week's episode, I was thinking a lot about the song Since You've Been Gone by Kelly Clarkson. Do you know that jam?
Of course.
So I recently, I don't know, some interview, some kind of YouTube hole, discovered that Since You've Been Gone is a parody.
I think I know what you're going to say. Oh, no.
Not a parody, but like it was an attempt to kind of copy a Yeah 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 song called Maps. Did you know this?
No.
So the producer...
Because I know both of those songs.
Yeah. So Maps, like, Yeah Yeahs is like they were like one of my favorite bands when I was younger. I love them so much. Even before Maps, I was always a huge Yeah Yeahs fan. And obviously when Maps hits, it's just an incredible experience. It's this beautiful, melancholic, sad song, but not like self-pitying. It has a kind of drive to it that's hard to explain what's happening in Maps. So it is a really interesting song. And Karen O very much is an artist. So these producers hear this song and they go, we want to make our version of Maps. And so you can actually hear it. There's like one particular guitar sound, which was very unique to Maps, that is all throughout Since You've Been Gone. And there's all this other production around it, so it kind of swallowed whole. But it made me appreciate the AS so much more. But also, strangely, it makes me appreciate this Kelly Clarkson song so much more. But I think it's such a great example of people on the fringe being absorbed by the mainstream. You create this, you're in this art rock band, and it's not a surprise that you turn around and see it in pop music a couple of years later.
It's weird because I can't wait to listen to it now and hear that. But I often do that with songs where like I have no musical ability, but I have this odd ability to hear something and be like, you know what this sounds like? And you like pick out these little moments of like, that's exactly the same from this song from like 30 years ago. Very odd, but I wonder how many times it's conscious and how many times it's an accident. But that's really cool.
What's up
for
with
me, Robbie? Yeah. So do you remember? So the Toronto Raptors came into the NBA in, I believe, 94, 95. And just like any expansion team in sports, they're usually bad for the first bunch of years.
Right.
It's hard to get excitement because they're new. Anyway, do you remember the moment, for me anyway, when the Raptors changed?
No.
When Vince Carter won the dunk competition.
Oh.
With those wearing the Toronto jersey, and it was getting tens across the board. The amount of pride you felt because no one cared about Toronto, especially it's the only, I mean, Vancouver was there for a little bit, but it was the only Canadian franchise that lasted. And having Vince Carter, like there was hip hop songs referencing Toronto, and you're like, what? Oh my God, I'm going to get a Vince Carter jersey. And anyway, it just changed the way we felt about basketball. Hockey is my favorite sport, but it's so hard to show highlights of it because it's such an odd sport. And there is this guy, this young player now called Trevor Zegras. And he is doing these things that are polarizing old NHL people. Because NHL is supposed to be this like blue collar, rough sport where you're not that skilled. You're not fancy. You're tough. And you lose your teeth. And you fight people. But this guy, I would encourage anyone to just look up highlights from Trevor Zegras. And for me, it feels like that Vince Carter mode, where it's not just doing it for the Raptors or Toronto, but like for hockey as a whole, where you could show these highlights to people and be like, oh, wow. Like I've never seen someone do that in that entire sport. And so it's just got me really excited. And it's so funny to hear people talk about how they don't like what he's doing. Even though he's succeeding in scoring, there's still people saying the way he is achieving success is something that we never did when I was playing. Therefore, we don't like it. Yeah.
That's the old guard, right? The old guard resisting change. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you see the videos that I sent you?
I did. I watched one of them. Yeah. And it was cool.
What were your thoughts?
It was a young feller, and he was blindfolded, and a bunch of people were throwing dodgeballs at him, and he shot a puck while blindfolded at a goalie.
Okay.
And it went to the net,
right.
and everyone went,
okay.
Yeah, he's blindfolded. And so, yeah, I think that's cool, man. If you want to get me into hockey, this is a good first attempt. If everyone in hockey was blindfolded and the people were throwing dodgeballs, I think I would be definitely more interested in the sport, for sure.
What if he was a shapeshifter?
Ooh, maybe he is.
Okay. You know what? This podcast is brought to you by the Sonar Network. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe, hit that bell. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts so other improvisers like you can find us. Robbie Norman, thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
Bye.